Kia ora mai anō tātou e hui nei. Wene o mātou I titiru mai nei, ia mātou I tēnei wā, tēnei ki te mihi atu nei kia koutou. Anō reira e koutou, e waia mai nei, e titiru mai nei, e whakarongo mai nei, tēnā rā koutou, tēnā rā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Hoi no mu atu tō tātou nei, hui tanga I tēnei wā, hoi no ki tukua nei te arawhata ki tō tātou nei matunui te rangi I tēnei wā. Anō reira I noe tātou. E pā mana ka te koe mātou I kore piko no e mui a koe. Ke kaha koe te tuku mai tō aroha tō wairua arungi a mātou. Ke kaha koe te tuku mai nei te aroha a mō mātou nei whānau nā mātou nei wahiro o mātou nei wākainga. A putano ki ueni o mātou nei ngā kaumātua kuia e noho mā wiwi mai nei roto a mātou nei kāinga putano roto a mātou nei hoipere. Ke kaha koe te tango ngā mea kino e pā nei noa rātu nei tina nā hine ngaro wairua. Nō reira e pā ke kaha koe te manaki a mātou me wa mātou nei kaupapa e whāriki nei mui a koe I tēnei wā. Nō reira pāna hoki te rangatiratanga me te kaha me tau kuroria ake tunu. Amen.
Amen.
Anō reira kia ora mai anō tātou. Kia ora mai anō koutou e titiro mai nei a mātou I tēnei wā. Tēnei ke te mihi atu nei kia koutou. Hoi no e kōrero tēnei kia koutou. A puta anō ki wā tātou nei tini mate tini ai. Tua rātou ko wheturangi tia rātou ko hoki atu nei ki te kōpu te whenua. Tēnei ke te mihi atu nei. Kia rātou ko wheturangi tia. Koe tēnei te kōrero hinga atu nei he te kura. Rātou ko wheturangi tia. Haere tonu, haere tonu, haere tonu. Ara mai anu he te kura anō ko tātou tēnei. Ngā kanu ora I hui nei rarata tuini e tō tātou nei whare. I roto tēnei whare. A puta anō kia koutou I roto tō koutou nei whare. Anō reira tēnei ke te mihi atu nei kia koutou. E hoa mā, ngā rangatira mā. E mātaki nei a mātou I tēnei wā. Tēnei ke te mihi atu nei kia koutou. Tēnei ke te mihi atu nei kia koutou. Ai tēnei wā. Tēnei ke te mihi atu nei kia koutou. Mō tō tātou nei kaupapa e whāriki nei mui a tātou I tēnei wā. Ngā kōrero nei ma te whakamomuri. Tēnei ke te mihi atu nei kia koutou. Puta anō ki te tēpu nei. Ki te mihi atu nei, ki wā tātou nei rangatira, kia kourua rā I haere mai nei I tēnei wā. Ki te mihi atu nei, kia kourua. Nō reira e hoa mā ngā rangatira, tēnei ki te mihi atu nei, e hatu atu tēnei wahanga ki wā tātou nei, kai whakahaere o tō tātou nei hui, tanga tēnei wā. Ko Moira Clooney, tēnei. Ko Pānia Lee tēnei o tātou mo te Mental Health Foundation. Anō reira e hoa mā ngā rangatira mā tēnei ke te mihi atu nei, o reira huri noa, anō reira kia ora mai anō tātou katoa.
Tēnā tātou, tēnā koutou, nau mai, hoki mai. Ki ēnei o ngā raupapa webinar, mo tēnei kaupapa mate waka momori. Ko Pānia Lee, tēnei māua ko Moira Clooney. Welcome back to the final webinar of the series on Māori suicide prevention, brought to you by the Mental Health Foundation in collaboration with Victoria University and with the support of the Ministry of Health. For those of you who are just joining us today, my name is Pānia Lee and this is Moira Clooney. And we will be facilitating today's webinar on Māori suicide prevention, improving care and intervention with Dr. Lynn Russell and Dr. Nicole Coop.
Ngā mihi aroha kia koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome again to all of you and thanks so much for joining us for this third and final webinar. Before we introduce today's speakers, Nick and Lynn, I just wanted to run through the logistics for today. So some of you have heard this before. Our webinar runs from 12:30 to 1:30 today. We'll introduce the presenters, they'll both share some presentations and then we'll take questions from our audience around the country. If you have a question, you can send this through to us by email, by Twitter or Facebook. So you can email Sophia, SOPHIA, @mentalhealth.org.nz. On Twitter, you can tweet us at SuicideNZ, or on Facebook, you can leave a comment on the Mental Health Foundation's Facebook page. So you can do that right now or any time during the session today.
Nei rā te mei ki te pai toko rua, ko ko tākuta Lynn Russell, rawa ko tākuta Nicole Coop. He uri rawa tai no kai tau me rangitane, nau mai haramai e ngā puna mā tauranga. It's with great pleasure that we welcome today's guest presenters, Dr. Lynn Russell and Dr. Nicole Coop. Dr. Lynn Russell comes to us from Health Services Research School of Government, Victoria, University of Wellington, where she is a senior research fellow. Lynn is a registered nurse with a health background in service delivery, policy, teaching and research. Lynn completed her PhD in Māori studies at Massey University in 2006, examining cultural identity and well-being. Her postdoctoral research investigated the influence of culture among Indigenous peoples from Australia, Canada, and the US who have experienced mental illness. Lynn's interest in suicide research stems from both a personal and mental health research background. Her presentation today will reflect this stand. In her spare time, Lynn describes herself as a karaoke queen, wine taster, and wannabe artist. She is a proud mum of 5 and grandmother of 2, the 2 most handsome boys in the universe, Princeton, age 3.5, and Te Kaitiaki, age 6 months.
Dr. Nicole Coop is the Director of Kiriru Research and Evaluation and Development Limited. Dr. Coop has worked in Māori suicide prevention, investigating the relationship between identity and suicidal behaviour. She completed her PhD Whakamomori Māori suicide prevention in 2005 and has completed 2 postdoctoral research papers looking at the development of a chat tool for primary care that espoused a case finding and help assessment tool to assist practitioners with a holistic approach to well-being. Te Ira Tangata evolved from these studies and looked at cultural assessment for suicide prevention, using the process of pōwhiri as a model for engagement. So I'll pass over to Nick to start our presentations today. Kia ora.
Kia ora, ngā mihi kia koutou. Thank you to the Mental Health Foundation for enabling us to be here today. Ko waio, Nick Coop tōku ingoa. Takatimi te waka aura ki te mau ko waitaki te awa ko kaitahu rātou ko te ati awa Ngāti Toa Ngāti Rangitāne o Kuiwi. Kia ora koutou. Today I'm going to talk about Te Ira Tangata, a study that has recently been completed in Auckland and Northland. And I'll just get this ready. So a little bit of background knowledge around Māori suicide. Between 80 and 100 deaths per year, mostly males, in the age of 15 to 35, and mostly through hanging. For those Māori who attempt suicide, this approximately is 700 people throughout New Zealand per year, who are mostly females, with a median age of around 30 and mostly through overdose. This phenomenon is scattered throughout Aotearoa, making it even more difficult to prevent. This study involved a number of people, including Simon Hatcher, Mesa Jury, Reece Tapsell, Hinimoa Elder, a large advisory group, an even larger project team, and it has been evaluated as well. Recruitment included counties Manukau DHB, Northland DHB and Waitemata DHB. To be eligible to participate, you needed to be over 17, not currently attending school, and cognitively able to consent, and Māori. Randomisation into either treatment as usual, which we're going to call control group, or into the pōwhiri model of engagement, the intervention group. What we did was people who went into either one of those 3 emergency departments for an episode of deliberate self-harm, who was eligible, passed a psychosocial assessment and with a discharge summary, was Māori. We would collect information about their age, their deliberate self-harm, and randomise them into either the control group or into the intervention pōwhiri model. The control group got treatment as usual, so that would be exactly the same treatment that every DHB would be delivering to a person who self-harm presented. We would ask them to consent to the study, we'd give them some rating scales, and they'd be provided with the treatment as usual provided by the DHB. And we'd follow them up over 3 months and 12 months, and also use nationally collected data from NZHIS and DHB records. For those in the intervention group who got the Postvention model of engagement, which I'll take you through in a minute, they'd also receive patient support, problem-solving therapy, GP vouchers, a cultural assessment, and a risk assessment. So we wrap them up in a korowai of love and postcards scattered throughout the following 12 months. This study also ran alongside a non-Māori study called the Access study, which had very similar but without the Postvention model of engagement. Some of the measures we used were hopelessness and whether a person repeated, anxiety, depression, cultural identity, sense of belonging, quality of life measures, mortality over the next 3 months, 1 year, 5 years and 10 years, and their health service utilisation. And the Postvention model of engagement goes like this. So a Māori clinician would ask them to consent to the study. As we know, the wero is the most challenging part of the Postvention, whether a person chooses to engage with the process or not, and picks up the leaves on the ground. Now this is where we called that the consent process. It was a long process. It was making sure that everybody was comfortable with what was about to happen. The karanga, as we know, the karanga is where the woman calls the people onto the atia, and this process was really important for us. It was the going and having a look at their medical records, seeing who was coming, where they came from, who they had been with before, looking at all those processes before we actually spoke to them. Karakia would be performed at each of our engagements. The whai kōrero, where the boys get up and have their say, but it was also what we used was problem-solving therapy. And in problem-solving therapy, we looked at the issues that these people were presenting with, wrote them all down, and we specifically looked at culture or their levels of cultural engagement or their identity as one of the issues. The waiata is where we would ask them to go away and work on those issues that they'd worked on in their 6 to 8 problem-solving sessions, one of them specifically looking at their connected to their whakapapa and their whenua. And we'd ask them to come back and see how that worked. They'd be given a koha, and for every rating scales that they filled out, we would offer them a koha for participating. And at the end of those 6 to 8 sessions, we would be we would have come together as a whānau, the research clinician and the whānau who had presented to us. A feast was given at the end of each of the sessions, a cup of tea, and now we're doing the pōraporaki where we actually disseminate the findings from that research. So this all started back in 2009. We were aiming for 160 participants. To get those 160 participants, 580 people walked through the door. 360 of them met our inclusion criteria. That meant that they were old enough, they were cognitively able to consent, and they weren't at school. Of those, 95 consented to be in the intervention group and 72 consented to be in the control group. And we followed them up at 3 months and at 12 months, and we had a 71% response rate at the end. What we found is that by doing this, we significantly decreased hopelessness among Māori who had presented for self-harm, and we significantly increased the time before there was any representation to a hospital. So what can you do? It's simple, really. The answer is improving people's cultural identity. You can do this through problem-solving therapy, or, as my mate's going to talk about, kōrero. Improving access to te reo Māori, increasing people's knowledge of their whakapapa, increasing access to their own whānau, going to the whenua, going to their own marae can improve people's level of identity. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi kia koutou, and I look forward to your questions.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. We'll pass over to Lynn Russell to do the second presentation.
Ko te mea tūtahi, he mihi aroha ki ngā whānau kua pāngia e tēnei ngārara te mate whakamomori. He mihi tautoko ki te Mental Health Foundation, te whare wānanga o Victoria, me te manatū Hauora. He mihi hoki ki ngā kai kōrero kua kōrero hia, ko Kiri Lawson Te Aho, rātou ko Michael Naira, ko Di Grinnell, ko Takuho, ko Nicole Coop. I need to start my presentation today, probably first of all by apologising for looking down and reading, but by just explaining and acknowledging that what I present, while it is informed by my work as an Indigenous health researcher, it is not attached to any specific research project such as that Nick's just spoken about. Instead, it is largely drawn from what Di in her presentation referred to as through titiro whakarongo kōrero. It is a culmination of what I have both observed and heard primarily from those most affected and from my forced inclusion in that group called suicide survivors. My whānau have now had the horrific task of burying 8 of our own who have ended their lives. And yesterday marked 5 years since my children lost their dad, since his sisters and brothers lost their brother, since his nephews and nieces lost their uncle, and since his moko lost their papa. I just want to acknowledge those whānau, my whānau now. And I want to make one comment about speaking today. There is a fear associated with suicide that makes me not really want to be here. The fear begins with the words, what if? What if by speaking these thoughts I have formulated around making sense of and combating suicide out loud in front of so many, I reawaken the beast that sleeps? What if it happens again? I decided to agree to talk though because I can't live my life in fear, and because I so fundamentally believe that if we do not speak up and speak out, we will simply enable that sleeping giant. In the same way we refuse to talk about sexual abuse within our whānau, so have we swept suicide under that same mat, but not today. So as horrible as it is, I want to begin with making sure that we have a clear picture of the enormity of this beast that we are talking about, suicide, by looking at the stats of the people in our country who chose to end their lives between July 2007 and June 2012, all 2,700 plus of them. This graph clearly shows that there's been a steady and marked increasing number of Māori suicides almost every year in the last 5 to 6 years in comparison to other ethnic groups. Māori, for those of you who can't see it clearly, are the strong red line that keeps going up. The other groups are on there, blue, Asian, purple, Pacific, and other are in green. For the last 3 years, in about August or September, we have reacted as a country with shock and horror to this fact, and that's because around that time of the year the Chief Coroner Judge Neil McLean released his latest stats. The ones he released last year showed that 547 people intentionally ended their lives in the year ending June 30, 2012. That is 3 people in Aotearoa every 2 days, 45 every month. I'm sure most of you already know this, but around 290 people are killed on our roads a year, so that's 250 odd people less killed on our roads than by their own hands. Now let's look specifically at us, Māori. We have the dubious honour of having the highest rate of suicide out of every ethnic group in Aotearoa. Not only do we have the highest rate, but the number of Māori suicides has increased for most age groups. In the year ending June 30, 2012, we, Māori whānau, lost 9 of our tamariki aged under the age of 15, 37 of our 15 to 19-year-olds. Then there were 37 that were lost in their 20s, another 20 in their 30s, another 18 in their 40s, another 11 aged 50 and over. There's 132 of our whānau dead by suicide in 1 year. It's around 11 a month, and enough really for there to be continual tangi from suicides worth thinking about. In the year before that, 101 of our whānau took their own lives. A couple of years before that, there were 95. The year before that, 87. You can see the worrying trend. So what that tells me is whatever we are doing to try and combat this is either not enough or it's just not working. In the first of these webinars, Kiri Lawson Te Aho shared her extensive knowledge of Indigenous suicide with us, looking in particular at what she felt was needed to be done in the prevention of Māori suicide. She told us that a paradigm shift was required to deal with the issue of Māori suicide. We need to change the way we are looking at suicide. We need to privilege our Māori worldviews, knowledges and values, and whakamana our own processes, because that will drive a change in the way we design interventions, the way we think about Māori suicide prevention, and the way our strategies are formed. A key component of the centering of Māori values is the recognition that at the core of Māori is whānau, something each subsequent speaker has emphasised and something recognised by government through whānau water policies. I wholeheartedly agree with this, obviously. By privileging our worldviews, by placing whānau fair and square in the middle of what suicide is, we can change the way we think about Māori suicide prevention. But I think not only do we need to pitch our intervention at a whānau level, we need to pitch everything at a whānau level, including the information that we're putting out there. So let me start right now by telling you again about our statistics. In the year ended June 30, 2012, at least 90 Māori whānau grieved the painful loss of their tamariki or rangatahi who intentionally ended their lives. Quite probably, over 100 mothers buried their children they bore. Quite probably, over 100 fathers buried their sons and daughters they helped raise. Quite probably, hundreds of children buried the mums and dads they adored. Quite probably, hundreds of siblings buried the brothers or sisters they loved and respected. Quite probably, dozens of partners buried their soulmates. And then there were the aunties, uncles, cousins and moko. I would hazard a conservative guess that they are in their thousands. So then, this tells us the true story of Māori suicide. There were not 132 Māori who took their lives in the year ended 30 June 2012. There were thousands of whānau whose lives were changed forever by suicide. Suicide is not just an act of individuality, it has a collective impact. That's our worldview. So let's frame our response. When I was trying to work out what I was going to say today, I posed a question on my Facebook page, very non-academic, but anyway, asking for suicide survivors in particular to share their views about suicide prevention. Because in reality, I think I can probably tell you in one sole slide what I know with near certainty about suicide and about suicide prevention. This is my thoughts. Simply this, that suicide can only occur when a suicidal person is alone. When someone makes a decision to end their life, they believe at the time that it is the right thing to do and that it is the best thing to do. That suicide is not the decision made by a well mind or an intact wairua, and that suicide rarely, if ever, occurs without any warning. When I've been asked for advice by people dealing with suicidal whānau members, all I've been able to offer is two things. I tell them, if you know someone is suicidal, don't leave them alone. And I tell them to get every scrap of support around them, if they are the main supporter, or around the main supporter as they can. I'll come back to those two things a little later on if we get time. First of all, I'd just like to consider some of the replies to my academic Facebook question. This is one. was a question that was posted in response, actually. That was posed in response. It asked, if people could see how utterly bereft and devastated suicide leaves those most important to them, and how people damage themselves because of the loss of that loved one's suicide, of what it does to them, would it make a difference? A few years back, I spent some time talking in depth with a respected kuia about her whānau's response to the attempted suicide of one of the young women in her whānau. A hui was called where everyone came and everyone spoke. The kuia asked every person present to tell the young woman who had wanted her life ended what it would have been like for them had she succeeded. One by one, as painful as it was for that rangatahi, they did so. One of the younger whānau members' responses, I can't remember if it was a younger sister or what, but it struck me. She told the young woman through tears that had she died, she wouldn't have had someone to get hand-me-down clothes from. Now, we can kind of laugh at that, but the point made by this teina was that her tuakana line would have been broken. The kuia's response was that kuia's response was what pitching our interventions at whānau level looks like. It's also what privileging our worldviews, knowledges, values and processes looks like. But not all of us are resourced culturally, spiritually, emotionally enough to be able to respond in the same way. Years later, I found myself in the position where someone I loved dearly tried to end her life. I would have liked to have responded in the same way that kuia did. I would have liked those to whom she was precious to have told her how much she was needed, how much she was treasured, and how devastated we would have been had she succeeded. But I couldn't find the inner strength at that time. Di Grinnell raised this issue in the second webinar, referencing Mason's work, about whānau who do not have the material or social resources to be able to exercise rangatiratanga for their whānau. Maybe I did have these, but I certainly didn't have the strength to exercise that rangatiratanga for my whānau at that time. And it's at those times, as Kiri rightfully suggests, that we need to stand together and share our collective wisdom and skills. Sadly, that doesn't always happen. I touched briefly before on my fear of talking today, my fear of going too near to suicide, lest it follows me. There are many reasons suicide remains a hidden taboo in our collective whānau. There are many reasons why we don't openly talk about it. I've been to tangi and funerals of those who've taken their own lives where not once was there mention of the fact that this had happened. And I can't accept that that is a healthy response. I can't believe that that is helping us deal with the reality. Just as Judge McLean says, we need to bring the issue of suicide from out of the shadows. In my humble opinion, the way to do that is to let the stories be told. The second and third comments up here were both made by Indigenous women. Suicide needs to be discussed out in the open. For too long we've carried shame for having feelings of suicide, of suicide or knowledge that someone we love has taken their lives. We are bereft with confusion, guilt and anger. It's a kind of pain that is difficult to voice because it's so complex, but we must speak to it out loud without shame if we're ever going to heal from it. In the first webinar, Kiri shared the story of her nephew, Tike, mihi aroha ki a koe neho, moto kōrero. That process of storytelling is one which I believe we need to be engaging far more in. There is transformative potential in storytelling for Indigenous peoples recovering from the trauma of suicide. Stories have been a primal form of communication since time began. Through stories, we share passions, sadness, hardships, joys, we share meaning and purpose, we connect to others, and we understand our place in the world. Storytelling also plays an essential role in Indigenous healing, and in order to recover from hurt, whether that be from the layered historical or transgenerational trauma that's been described in previous webinars, or whether that be from the social, emotional, spiritual, cultural trauma of the suicide of your partner, son, daughter, there must be healing. Kiri made an important point in her presentation about the role of kōrero and storytelling in suicide prevention, intervention and postvention. She said whānau must be facilitated to tell their own stories. I 100% agree. Studies show that in being listened to and telling their life stories, People whose lives have been scarred by mental illness gain restoration of self-worth, validation, confidence, autonomy and self-trust. They begin to exercise control over their lives as they determine for themselves how to improve their situation through the telling of their stories. In the same way, those scarred by suicide begin to heal through the telling of their stories and of their loved ones' stories. I think it was Eduardo Duran who was referred to as saying the rungo or healing is in the pain. In 2009 and 2010, as part of my postdoc study, I was fortunate enough to spend time with a number of Indigenous communities around Australia and Northern America, talking with them and listening to their understandings of Indigenous mental health and wellbeing. And while I was in Alice Springs, I was introduced to by the manager of the Mental Health Association of Central Australia, Laurentia Grant, to their suicide prevention program called the Life Promotion Program. In particular, I heard about a training package they have called Suicide Story. Essentially, Suicide Story was designed to get Aboriginal people talking about suicide. It was based on the ideas behind gatekeeper training or suicide first aid intervention, which is a type of training that provides skills to intervene when someone is at immediate risk of suicide. People are trained to notice and then stop them at the gate. So Suicide Story recognises that the people who have the relationships are those both best placed to notice changes in behaviour and best placed to gain the trust of a suicidal person, so therefore best placed to intervene before suicide occurs. Suicide Story involved listening to the stories of Aboriginal people and placing the issue of Aboriginal suicide in their worlds. It was about getting the conversations happening, giving people permission to talk, and giving people better tools to know how to handle suicidal behaviour in their whānau and communities. What impressed me about it was that it was developed with and for Indigenous people to help with their understandings about Aboriginal suicide, which is a fairly new phenomenon, by the way, and what they could do to respond to both serious concerns and common threats of suicide. Importantly, it also employed Aboriginal people to help deliver the training. One of the trainers that I met, for example, had developed a program activity around fire, which has a central role in Aboriginal life. Whānau members or community members in that program were asked to identify the things in life that fed a person's inner fire, that kept them going each day, and the things that could cause a person's fire to die down and what needed to be done to restoke the fire. This program built on Indigenous storytelling as a tool for Aboriginal suicide prevention. I had the privilege of hearing a couple of Aboriginal people telling their suicide stories when I was in the Alice, and there's no doubt that they were powerful and effective in being told. In the same way that storytelling is recognised for its healing potential with Indigenous communities harmed by trauma, so was it here being used to prevent further trauma. This kind of Indigenous approach is what I personally would like to see built more on here in Aotearoa. In both previous webinars, we've had reinforced the view that the answers to Māori suicide prevention lay within ourselves as Indigenous people. My solutions, it's a pretty extraordinarily optimistic label, to Māori suicide prevention are not really rocket science. They lay simply in the processes that we know culturally and intrinsically to work. When we have anything to discuss, we hui. And the core function of hui, besides whanaungatanga, manaakitanga, etc., is kōrero. I undertook some research last year of rangatahi Māori looking at how to support whānau, to support rangatahi to make healthy decisions around sexual health. And one of the key findings of the research was the emphasis that rangatahi placed on communication with them by and with their whānau. A quote that stood out came from a young man who said, "It doesn't matter what the conversation is about, just talk to me." We need to talk to each other about suicide and about its effect on us, because without the conversations there may never be the chance for people like this friend of mine whose quote is in front of you now, to build the trust that she needs to with someone to ask for help when she needs it. She described a theme running through her life when she becomes suicidal. She described acute feelings of isolation, of being unloved, unwanted, and abandoned, and the obsessiveness of those feelings. She described messages from her childhood and teenagehood being reinforced in her adulthood. And sadly, those sentiments are not uncommon, but this is something we can all do. Take the time to talk and listen. It saddens me that she actually made this statement, mainly because I too didn't sit long enough. She says it was definitely obvious that I was unwell, even work colleagues could see it, but no one made inquiry or pushed me further or sat with me long enough for me to trust that I could share this with them and that they would help me get help. Before I end today, I just want to offer up one more thought of mine, again based only on observation, intuition and experience. I have this theory that in all whānau, in all communities, there is someone who stands out as, or some ones who stand out as Pautoko Manawa. Someone who keeps standing when all the rest fall. Someone who constantly offers a place of rest to the weary or wisdom to the lost. I'm not necessarily talking about our kaumātua here either. Sometimes in my experience and observation, these whānau members are the ones who have weathered some of the greatest storms in life and who perhaps are the most weathered looking as a result. Their strength comes from within. Just as the suicide story training I referred to earlier recognises that those who have the relationships within the communities are those best placed for suicide prevention in their communities, so do I believe this is the case with our Pautoko Manawa within our whānau. I have a theory that I've yet to test through research, just waiting for someone to fund me, putting that out there, that when these po fall, so do the whānau. So our task is to identify those whānau members and place support around them. In my mind, it's a bit like when you build a fence or some other structure, you place the poles in the ground, but you need the stabilisers, kind of seen there in the picture, to give those poles support until the concrete is set. If the stabilisers to keep the poles straight aren't in place, the foundations of the fence will always be a bit dodgy. I know who those po are in my whānau, but I really see them getting the support they require, and I've witnessed firsthand what happens once they fall. The ripples or quakes continue for a long, long time, and the rebuilding is a long, slow process. The fence or structure is also forever changed. I think if we could spend some time building the supports of our po, our whānau would be much safer places. It's my whakaaro anyway. Nō reira, mihi nui kia koutou katoa, anō he mihi aroha, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Nicole, for your insights, and Lynn especially for sharing some of your story. Just before we get into the questions, just a quick reminder of how you can send through questions for our presenters. You can send them by email, Twitter or Facebook. So you can email Sophia, SOPHIA, @mentalhealth.org.nz. On Twitter, you can tweet us @SuicideNZ, or on Facebook, you can leave a comment on the Mental Health Foundation's Facebook page. So the first question that I've got came through for Nick from a social worker on the West Coast. She says, I often hear from other professionals that this person does not want to engage with their culture. They don't want to identify as Māori. They say because it's full of violence, because it's just never been good for me, it's been a bad experience. And it seems to be that we as professionals perpetuate this by buying into this through fear of not wanting to force culture on people. She says this happens particularly from non-Māori professionals. How do we get around this? I, as a professional, understand and see the values and importance of connection, and your study totally validates that. But how do we work with people who don't or won't want anything to do with their culture, and yet it's part of why they're unwell and won't stay well? How do we get around this?
Exactly, and it's a common question that's given to me in particular. People aren't ready to address some of the issues, so we need to take it slowly, and we need to find those parts of the whānau that are healthy, aren't violent, are in good spaces, it's those po or the support that we've just heard about, and it's finding those small links into the whānau to enable that to happen. As for clinicians that are working and engaging with these people, start with some of those problems that are easy to solve and then work towards the harder ones, which is to become re-engaged with their whakapapa and whenua. So a lot of the people who present for self-harm are going to be in this place, so let's make it easy for them and start off small and find the good parts of the whānau to connect to.
Thanks.
Kia ora. So I think the common thread with our presenters today, and also the previous three presenters, was the importance of kōrero. So Lynn talked about the significance of storytelling in healing trauma, and Nick emphasised the importance of cultural identity in therapy and returning to the stock root of their story through whakapapa. And so one of the questions from an Indigenous woman, well, in the presentation from Lynn, one of the Indigenous women identified that suicide was complex. And one of the questions was, is Māori suicide really complex? This is also a question from a Māori Indigenous woman. And since when have Māori been complex people?
That's you.
Either one.
Maybe we should start by asking, since when have Māori been simple people? But complex, yeah, I do agree. Suicide is a complex issue in terms of having many facets to it, many reasons behind it, and many strings attached. I was hoping that the presentation today might suggest that some of our responses don't need to be that complex, though. That there are things that we can be doing within our communities that are fairly simple. The simple act of giving people the time and of listening and of seeking out stories, I think, kind of goes a long way in supporting people who are not well.
Maybe related to that, just a question from a GP in Naporiki who asks, what three key things, thinking about simple responses, what three key things would you advise a rural Pākehā GP to do to help address the risk of suicide in Māori?
Ask the person that they're talking to about their access to their whānau and what that looks like. Ask them about whether they can find ways of getting to a healthy component of their whānau to talk about their whakapapa and talk about their whenua and talk about those things that reconnect us to this world and not the next world. And just talk and keep talking and offer the time, as Lynn said, offer the time, sit and offer the time.
Can I just add to that? I think it's really, there's an important thing that people at the primary level, practitioners at the primary level, need to take into consideration, and that is that when somebody presents in front of you who you have concerns about their well-being in terms of suicide, who's Māori, I've been in a situation where whānau have not been included in that process because of a perception of confidentiality. Now, confidentiality is about the choice of the person in front of you. So the best thing, I think, if you want to be engaging whānau, which you should be doing, if you want to be engaging whānau with your clients, then, and you think that confidentiality is an issue, ask them if it's okay for them to be bringing someone with them, to be asking different questions. Look, I could tell you stories about questions being asked of people who are severely unwell, who have gone on to take their lives, that had those questions been asked of the whānau who know that person or those people intimately, a different picture would have been painted and a life or lives could have been saved. So I can't emphasise enough the importance from my perspective of including whānau in those consultations with the permission, of course, of the person. I think that there is a bit of a fallacy to think that most of us do want to act as individuals. Sure, we have our autonomy and we have that right to do so, but quite often that might be an assumption. So ask the person, talk to the person, find out from them what they want, what's best for them. I kind of think that most of us know what works well for us.
I have a question from a programs facilitator in Huntly, who is part of the Super Māori Fellas, a group of like-minded fathers who travel by motorcycle to highlight issues of importance. And his question is around postvention, around those who have lost loved ones. And his question is, how do we heal that hurt and use what has happened to raise that awareness so that whānau don't feel whakamā and uncomfortable? At times I feel uncomfortable in a way that is hard to describe. I relate that to wairua and releasing it for whānau. Is this relevant and a real component of what we are trying to achieve?
Yeah, I'll start that one. Postvention is the best prevention, and the best process around postvention is tangihanga, and going through the process of tangihanga in an appropriate way and meeting those Kubler-Ross levels of denial and anger and going through all of those 5 stages. And tangihanga it's been written up around the world as the best grieving process for death. And so why wouldn't suicide have the same process?
I totally agree. Postvention is the best prevention. It's probably, in my opinion, where we should be pouring far more resources into. Tangihanga, as Nick said, have been shown to be so important in the beginning of our healing process, but it is the beginning of our healing process. That process goes on for
years.
For a long time. Who's the name of the group? Super Māori Fellas. Chirp. Just as I hope that you got out of presentations today, allowing whānau to talk is a really, really important tool for healing, an extraordinarily important tool for healing. And the need to talk and to tangi and to blame and to blame self and blame others or whatever the process takes just needs to be allowed to happen. So Super Māori Fellas, you wrap yourselves around those people and allow them to do that. Ka pai.
Kia ora. Another question about talking, but in a clinical setting. Someone asks, can we hear more about problem-solving therapy and how that works for Māori? From your research.
Say that again, sorry.
Sorry, can we hear some more about problem-solving therapy and how that works for Māori?
Okay, it's a really simple process. It's 5 steps. There's actually a book out there you can read about problem-solving therapy, but it starts off with identifying where a person is negatively or positively, can look at problems, and most people who present for self-harm negatively look at problems, so that means they're not able to come up with a number of solutions. The next step is to list a number of the problems that these people think they've got, and just to let them do that, allow them to list all the problems. And then you talk with them about this. You pick one, you pick an easy one. You don't start with the relationship breakups. You start with, I didn't have money to pay for the phone bill, or I have to be kicked out of the house, or pick the simpler problems first. and you ask them to, with one of those problems, you ask them to come up with a number of solutions that they can think of in that session, and then you assist them with a few more of them, because often they only come up with 2 or 3 solutions, and then you guide them through other potential solutions, and then you ask them to go away and try some of those out, and that's that wire to part of the Postvention model, where you ask them to come back and report how they went with that, and you do that cycle. It's a very simple training process. You do that cycle a couple of times, and then you tackle something hard, like access to whānau, or access to their whakapapa, access to their land, and you work through the solutions with them. And at the end of those 6 to 8 sessions, you recap where you've come from. At the beginning, it was to deal with the unpaid bill, and at the end, you're dealing with connecting them back to their whānau. So, and they can take that away. And through our evaluation of that research, we've found that a number of people who have done the problem-solving therapy are now using that on their kids and their mothers and everybody else around them, because it's such a simple framework, and they can use it when things start getting difficult. So they've got a tool they can carry in their back pocket on a day-to-day basis.
Cool. Kia ora. Another question around clinical settings, I suppose. What's currently funded to support Māori suicide prevention in DHBs or clinical settings around the country?
I think there are some DHB coordinators, of which one of them is Māori. I know that there are a number of kia piki sites which are community-based, but otherwise there's limited actual direct funding for Māori suicide prevention at this point, unless someone else knows of something else going on.
Okay. We've got time for a few more questions, but we're running a bit low, so just a reminder, if you want to send through any more questions, flick them through by email to Sophia, SOPHIA, at mentalhealth.org.nz. You can send them on Twitter at SuicideNZ, or you can leave a comment on the Mental Health Foundation Facebook page. Question around whānau. Many individuals are depressed because they don't have good connections with whānau, because they may have been let down, abused or abandoned by whānau. Someone asks, in this case, is a cultural setting really better than a GP in terms of treatment? I'm not sure if that's an either or, but one of you might have a comment on that.
I think Di Grinnell touched on this in the second webinar, where she suggested that it wasn't necessarily an either or situation, that the two can work in parallel with each other. But that point about whānau being, or people being disconnected from their whānau, and often for good reason, is acknowledged. And my PhD research, I interviewed tangata whaiora, the vast majority of whom about their whole life experiences involving mental health and their cultural identity, and the vast majority of those participants were dislocated from their whānau, either by choice or not by choice, but there was dislocation from their whānau. Now, and their histories generally gave good reason for that. When I asked them the question, would they want to have a connection with their whānau again, I can't remember the exact question I asked, every single one said they did. So I guess at some point there is a fundamental need within us to belong. And for Māori, as we said at the beginning, it comes down again to whānau. Now, that is not, having said that, I do acknowledge for many the place of kaupapa whānau within our lives. So, yeah. Karo.
Kia ora. Kia ora. So we've got a few schools tuned in, and one school has a question or a statement saying, we have students who struggle with identity, who are adopted or don't know who their father is, etc. They are missing whakapapa. Are there support groups for them? If whakapapa is important?
I'm adopted, and not that I'm aware of, but there's always somebody who knows something. And it took until I was 22, and I was at a marae, and I was training care piki coordinators, and I talked about that I had whāngai whakapapa, and I had toto whakapapa. I had blood and I had adopted whakapapa. And someone came up to me and said, "So what do you know about your bloodlines?" And I said, "Not very much," and I just mentioned some names, and they said, "I'm going to take you to your father now." So, it's those sort of chance meetings and opening up and talking about that eventually, and it may take time, it may take 50 years, but it may take time for someone to come up to you and say, "I know your family, I know your whakapapa, and I can take you there." Now, mine's a good news story, but you've got to be able to be open enough to say that. You've got to be open enough to be able to talk to strangers about that, and eventually something may come.
That other, just in response to schools asking this question, whakapapa's tapu, so it's not the place of everybody to be giving that information. Just mindful of that.
Kia ora. That seems like it's probably a good place to wrap up. So thank you again to all of you watching for your time and attention. Thanks to both of our presenters, Lynn and Nick. It was great to hear both of your perspectives on this issue. And thanks again to Victoria University of Wellington for hosting us, and my colleagues at the Mental Health Foundation for putting this webinar and this series together. The slides and video from this session will be on our website shortly, so if you've registered, we'll send you through the link when those are available. Otherwise, keep an eye on the SPINS website, that's spinz.org.nz. The slides and video from the other two webinars are on our website as well if you missed those or you want to check them out again. Thank you again. I'll pass over to Pania.
Tēnā tātou, ko tēnei te raupapa webinar whakamutunga. Nā reira, he tika me i kia koutou ki ngā kai kōrero kua kōrero here, ko Kiri, ko Dai, ko Michael, ko Lynn, ko Nick Cookie. He me i kau atu kia koutou katoa mō tō whakaro nui, hei timata tēnei kōrero. He kōrero hōhonu, engari he kōrero he tika me kōrero, ko tērā te kōrero o ngā kai kōrero. Nā reira, tēnā tātou, tēnā koutou.
Tēnā rā tātou katoa i tēnei wā. E hoa ngā rangatira korongo nei koe ki ngā kōrero e kōrero nei i roto tēnei whare putano ki tō koutou nei whare. O e no e hoa mai rangatira mā, ke kaha te kōrero, waingenui wa koutou nei whānau, putano. O e no e hoa mai, ki te mihi atu nei ki wako nei rangatira. I haere mai nei tēnei wā ki te mauria mai nei wā rātou nei whakaaro, mō tēnei, ma te whakamamuri, tēnei kaupapa e whāriki nei mui a tātou ma te whakamamuri. Hoi no e hoa ngā rangatira ko tae mai te wā, ki te whakamutungia o mā tēnei kōrero i tēnei wā, mō tēnei rā. Hoi no ki te mihi atu nei ki wāku nei hoa rangatira, Mental Health Foundation, ki te mihi atu nei ki wāku nei rangatira. Hoi no e hoa mai he rangatira mā koe tēnei te waiata. Tātou i tēnei. E whakarongo mai ki te tangi a te manu nei, e rereru nā rawa e. Tui ai, tui ai runga, tui ai raro, tui ai roto, tui ai wā. Tui ai. Kārere te awa, kārere te po, tui ai. Anō reire i roto tēnā, hoi no ke kapi ato tātou nei, wahanga i te ngakraki, nō reira ino e tātou. E pāmana ke te koe mātou e kore piku nei mo i a koe, ka hako e te tuku mai nei tō aroha, tō wairu ni a mātou. Puta anō ki ngā kōrero i whariki nei mo i a koe, ke ka hako te mana ki ka hako te tuaki. Anō re pāna hoki te rangatiratanga me te kaha me tau kōria, ake ake tumu. Amen.
Amen.
Kia ora mai anō tāte katoa.
Kia ora mai.